So here we are, we're still talking about sensitivity, specificity, predictive value positive, predictive value negative, and then right at the end I threw in a calculation with prevalence. And a lot of times students ask the question, well, why are we even including prevalence within this particular type of analysis? And the reason is that disease prevalence actually has an effect on the predictive value within a screening test. What I'm trying to get at is that when we have very low prevalence of disease, the predictive value positive actually falls. Remember, predictive value positive is that we're trying to predict with a screening test those that have the disease, those with all those that truly do have the disease. So how well does this particular screening test actually identify those that truly do have the disease? And the predictive value negative, those that actually do not, are being diagnosed as not having it with the screening test. So what that means, though, is that if you have a high prevalence disease, you will have a very high predictive value positive and a low predictive value negative. Whereas if you have very little disease, it's very difficult to identify those individuals that have the disease, the predictive value positive will actually fall, and the predictive value negative, all those that actually don't have the disease, because there's very few cases, will actually rise. In addition to understanding prevalence with respects to predictive value positive and negative, there's also a relationship between sensitivity and specificity. You want a test that's really highly sensitive and really highly specific, but you have to understand there's a give and take based on those cut points within a particular screening test, that you cannot have 100% sensitivity and 100% specificity. You want to include you want to make sure that you're gathering all the individuals that truly have the disease. You want a test that would be highly sensitive. In order to do that, the cut point used to classify individuals as disease should be moved farther into the range of the non-disease. So what you're doing is that you will identify with a highly sensitive test, you will be able to identify all those that truly have the disease, and you're going to include some false positives. Whereas if you're trying to improve specificity, the cut point should be moved farther in the range typically associated with the disease. So we have a scenario here where we want to ensure that those that do not have the disease, or we're saying that do not have the disease, will actually begin to include some on the far range of those that may have the disease. Remember, with diagnostic tests, it's not cut and dry. It's not a yes or no scenario, even with biological tests. For sure with behavioral type and mental health issues. But with biological tests, be it an enzyme analysis, or you're looking at antibodies, or you're even looking at viral counts and things like that, there is a sensitivity and a specificity. The way that students have a better way of looking at it is you have a bell curve, where you have a scenario where you have normal individuals that will present with a set of symptoms, be it healthy, or even when they are not diseased, they could potentially display a set of symptoms. And then within that scenario, you also have a group of individuals that are diseased. And so you need to think about, when you look at sensitivity and specificity, how sensitive do we need to have our particular screening test, or how specific do we need to have our screening test? So ideally, you want to have it kind of in a scenario with letter B here, where you may miss some individuals that are on the far end of the bell curve with their presentation of the disease. But depending on the type of the disease or the type of health behavior, it may not be okay to miss some individuals that have the disease. So depending on what you're trying to measure, you may need to have a test that's highly sensitive, or you may have to have a test that's highly specific. And that's where you can look at it from this perspective, is that what does C mean when we look at it, as in is it highly sensitive or is it highly specific? What does A mean? Is it highly sensitive? And that's what that means. A means that it's highly sensitive, as in we're almost getting every single diseased individual. But we may include a few false positives. Whereas with C, you have a scenario where we're saying all these individuals, we're making sure all individuals that are indeed normal or they do not have the disease, but we may include a few of the diseased individuals. And so we may have several false negatives in that situation. And so that's what I want you to think about, is that should there be different cut points for different diseases? And it's important as an epidemiologist, as scientist, as physician, as how that is actually determined. For example, if it's a rare or very prevalent disease, or what's the severity of the outcome. For example, if death is the outcome, we want to have a very high sensitive type disease. If it's very rare, is it okay for us to be able to have a highly specific test, but we may end up missing that one every now and then. So in order to improve sensitivity and sensitivity and specificity, you need to think about there's characteristics or there's features in any type of screening test where you can improve that if you're looking at ways to try and make sure that you're getting all the cases or making sure you're diagnosing all the normal individuals. So one way to improve sensitivity and specificity is you would retrain screeners, as in reduce the amount of misclassification in tests that require human assessment. For example, doing a blood pressure reading during pregnancy, you would want to be able to make sure that you're classifying those individuals that indeed do have high blood pressure. Or you can recalibrate the screening instrument that would reduce the amount of imprecision. For example, I do this in my lab all the time, where every year I have certain instruments that are recalibrated to ensure that I maintain sensitivity and specificity. You may need to utilize a different test that's out there. Replace a reliable or low validity test with an improved test that has been introduced. Or you may need to use more than one test that's out there and do multiple types of readings to improve that sensitivity and specificity. So now that you have the types of screening tests that are out there, it's important that you understand that screening programs and screening tests are constantly needing to be evaluated to ensure that you are measuring what you intend to measure. And there's tests, there's methods for being able to determine, is that particular test sensitive enough? Is it specific enough? Do we have high predictive value positive, high predictive value negative? And that's where randomized controlled trials or ecologic time trend studies or case control studies are used to be able to evaluate those types of screening programs. I don't need to go into detail about these types of methods since we've already covered them, but you can see how a case control study could actually be used to determine does this screening program actually measure what it intends to measure? Or think about a controlled trial, as in you have a new screening method and you want to see whether or not how it matches up with other screening tools that are available. In any case, when you look at these types of screening methods that are out there, there is the possibility that these screening methods allow for bias to actually be introduced. So even though you're trying to run these trials or these studies in a way to determine the effectiveness of these screening programs, there is the possibility that bias would be introduced. Some of those bias that can be introduced in these types of screening tools that are out there, for example, is lead time bias. That's the perception that a screen-detected case has a longer survival because the disease was identified earlier. And so the idea behind this is that a screening test, that there is that perception that if you have a screening test, it is better. So that person will actually live longer. And that's where an evaluation tool, such as a controlled trial or a time series analysis, will actually be able to help identify whether or not there is bias that could be introduced in those different types of study design. Length bias. This is particularly relevant to cancer screenings. This is the idea that tumors identified, like for example within cancer, tumors identified by screening are slower growing and have a better prognosis. This is a bias where you have a screening test. You identify an individual that has a particular tumor. You have a better prognosis because you identified it earlier, when in reality it may not actually change the outcome. That's considered length bias. And then there's selection bias. And this is motivated participants have a different probability of disease than those who refuse to participate, as in they're willing to participate in these types of studies, where are these particular studies, and you're trying to determine whether or not these screening tests actually could change the outcome. And the idea behind selection bias, if they're participating, is that those that are willing are actually going to try and change or make changes in their life, whereas those that don't, they will have a different outcome. In any type of a screening test, you need to always think of it from the perspective of the natural history of any type of disease. With screening tests, it's ideal that you have a test where you can identify it early enough in the natural history of the disease to where you can actually then make changes or be able to make a diagnosis or be able to implement an intervention or a prevention type strategy. As I talked about with the HIV case, or late stage HIV, and if there is no way to make changes, is it ethical or is it scientifically sound to be able to implement that particular type of test? In any case, though, one has to remember that it's not so simple, even with screening tests. There is a real issue with being able to, with classification of morbidity and mortality. It is often really, really difficult to be able to take a screening test and be able to jam a particular diagnosis into a screening test, as in it may not fit specific criteria. You have a screening test that you think is really highly specific and sensitive to identify individuals with a particular outcome. It just may not be all that reliable. It's just really, really challenging to be able to classify individuals or classify diseases in that. And that's where statistical analyses often can help with trying to arrange a particular type of set of questions within a questionnaire, as well as a particular set of biological type of tools in order to be able to compile that to look for similarities and features. There's two types of criteria used for classification of ill individuals. One is causal, and that's easier to look at because you know that you have an infectious disease. Remember, with screening type tools, you have an infectious disease. We're looking for the cause of that particular disease, and can we identify it early enough? Then there's screening tests where you're trying to look at manifestational, where you look at, for example, symptoms, that you look for a set of symptoms. Can we screen for those symptoms? Can we identify them and be able to move forward with making an accurate diagnosis? But as I said, is that the issue that we still have with classifying based on screening tests is that it's just not all that easy at times. Specifically with manifestational as well as with causal, is that sometimes it's very difficult to classify a particular disease outcome based on a set of criteria. For example, with a behavioral disorder, with autism, or with ADHD, or with depression, or it's difficult to classify those sets of symptoms with a particular screening test. Another one would be fibromyalgia. How does that actually fit when there is no specific set of criteria? We have manifestation, and we can identify it after an individual is presenting with those particular symptoms. But those symptoms vary, and it makes it really, really challenging to be able to say, can we even make a screening test that could fit into this, that could identify individuals early enough to where changes could be made? I hope this was helpful. This was Chapter 11 in epidemiology with screening tests. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions, send me emails or give me a call. Thanks a lot.